7 signs your prayers are being heard by God. There are moments when prayer feels like the loneliest place in the world. You speak, you hope, you wait, and nothing seems to change. No thunder from heaven, no immediate breakthrough, just the same questions sitting with you day after day. And in that quiet, a dangerous thought begins to form. Is God even listening? But the silence you're experiencing is not empty. It is not abandonment. It is not proof that your prayers are failing. Scripture shows us again and again that God often does his deepest work where human ears expect noise, but heaven chooses stillness. The Bible never promises instant answers, but it does promise a listening God. And there is a profound difference between a God who answers on demand and a God who answers with purpose. Prayer was never meant to be a transaction where we insert words and receive outcomes on our timeline. It is a relationship, and relationships grow in ways that are often invisible before they are undeniable. When God hears a prayer, he doesn't always rush to change the situation. Very often, he begins by changing the person who is praying. That process can feel slow, uncomfortable, and confusing, especially when you're asking for something that feels urgent or deeply personal. Many believers assume that unanswered prayer means ignored prayer. The Bible tells a very different story. God heard Hannah long before Samuel was born. God heard David while Saul was still chasing him. God heard Israel while they were still in bondage. Hearing does not always look like delivering. Sometimes it looks like preparing, protecting, refining, and aligning. If you're still praying, still seeking, still holding on, something is already happening. The fact that you haven't given up is not a coincidence. Faith that persists in silence is often the clearest evidence that God is near. He does not measure prayer by volume or eloquence. He responds to sincerity, surrender, and trust. In this message, we are not looking for emotional reassurance or religious clichés. We are looking at the patterns Scripture reveals, the quiet, consistent signs that God is listening even when answers feel delayed. These signs are rarely dramatic. They often unfold internally before anything shifts externally. And if you recognize even one of them in your life, it may be God's way of saying, I hear you. I'm working. Stay with me. Let's begin in a way that does not rush. Number 1, you are being drawn into deeper stillness with God. When God hears a prayer, one of the first things he often does is quiet the noise around it. Not because he is distant, but because he is close. Scripture shows that God frequently moves people away from chaos and into stillness before revealing his direction. Stillness is not inactivity, it is attention. It is the posture of someone being taught to you may notice as much as they speak. In seasons where your prayers seem unanswered, you may notice a strange shift inside. You feel less compelled to explain yourself to everyone, less frantic in your asking, less restless in your waiting. This is not emotional numbness. It is spiritual alignment. God is drawing you into a space where faith is no longer fueled by urgency, but by trust. The Bible repeatedly associates stillness with divine action. God speaks to Elijah not through fire or earthquake, but through a gentle whisper. Jesus himself withdraws to lonely places to pray, not because he lacks power, but because intimacy with the Father requires quiet. When your soul begins to crave silence rather than solutions, it is often because God is teaching you to recognize his presence without needing proof. Many people mistake this phase for spiritual dryness. In reality, it is spiritual depth. God is reducing distractions so that dependence becomes clearer. When the noise fades, your awareness of him increases. Prayer shifts from desperate pleading to settled confidence. You may not have the answer yet, but you are closer to the one who holds it. If God were ignoring you, he would not draw you closer. Distance produces indifference. Stillness produces awareness. The very fact that your heart is being quieted is evidence that your prayer has been received and is being processed in heaven. Number 2, Your heart is being changed before your circumstances. One of the clearest biblical signs that God has heard a prayer is that the person praying begins to change. Long before situations shift, God works on the heart. This is where many become discouraged because they asked for relief, not refinement. But Scripture reveals a consistent pattern. Transformation precedes manifestation. You may notice that your desires are being rearranged. Things that once felt essential now feel secondary. Reactions that used to come naturally begin to soften. Conviction becomes clearer, not as condemnation, but as loving correction. This is not God delaying your answer. This is God deepening your capacity to receive it. The Bible shows that God cares more about who you are becoming than what you are receiving. When prayers are heard, pride is often confronted, impatience is exposed, and motives are purified. This internal work can feel uncomfortable because it requires surrender. Yet it is one of the most personal ways God responds, by shaping you, not bypassing you. A changed heart is not a consolation prize. It is evidence of divine involvement. If God were uninterested, he would leave you untouched. But when he hears, he engages. He aligns your will with his so that when the answer arrives, it does not harm you, distract you, or replace him. Sometimes you realize you're praying differently, not because the need disappeared, but because trust has grown. The urgency softens, the fear loosens its grip. You begin to want God's will more than your own timing. That shift is not self-discipline, it is grace at work. Before God moves what is around you, he often moves what is within you. And that movement is one of the strongest signs that your prayers have reached his heart. Number 3. You experience unexplainable peace despite unanswered requests. There is a kind of peace that makes no sense when you look at your situation. Nothing has changed. The problem is still there. The prayer still feels unanswered. And yet something inside you is calm, not because you've stopped caring, but because you've stopped panicking. That peace is not emotional relief. It is spiritual confirmation. The Bible speaks of a peace that does not come from resolution, but from presence. It arrives before the answer, not after it. When God hears your prayer, he often responds by guarding your heart before he alters your circumstances. This peace does not deny reality. It steadies you in the middle of it. If your prayer were unheard, anxiety would intensify, fear would dominate your thoughts. But when peace begins to replace desperation, it signals that heaven has already responded. God is assuring you that you are not alone in the waiting. That assurance is often the first response he gives. This peace doesn't eliminate questions. It simply removes their power to control you. You still hope, you still pray, but the urgency shifts into confidence. You find yourself able to sleep, to breathe, to trust, without needing constant reassurance. That is not something you manufacture. It is something God provides. Many believers misunderstand peace as passivity. In reality, it is strength. Peace is not giving up. It is resting in the character of God while the outcome remains unseen. It is one of the most intimate ways it can feel, as though God is speaking through. I have heard you. Number 4. God begins closing doors you were praying would open. One of the most painful ways God answers prayer is by saying no, or not this way. Doors close, opportunities fade, plans fall apart. And at first, it feels like rejection. But Scripture teaches that closed doors are often proof of God's involvement, not his absence. When God hears a prayer, he considers not only what you want, but what you cannot see. He sees consequences, dangers, delays, and detours that are invisible to you. A closed door may be God protecting you from something that would have cost you more than you realize. In the Bible, redirection is rarely comfortable. It often feels like loss before it feels like guidance. Yet again and again, God shuts paths that lead to compromise, distraction, or harm, especially when his children ask him for direction. Silence would be easier. Closed doors require trust. If God were indifferent, He would let you walk into whatever you desired. But when he hears, he intervenes. He blocks what would pull you away from his purpose, even if it temporarily disappoints you. That disappointment is not punishment, it is preservation. Over time, many people look back and realize the door they begged God to open was the very one he lovingly kept shut, and the answer they thought they wanted was not the one they needed. Closed doors are not evidence of unanswered prayer. They are often the clearest proof that God is paying attention. Number 5. Scripture begins to speak directly into your situation. When God hears a prayer, he often answers through his word. Passages you've read before suddenly feel alive. Verses rise to the surface. At unexpected moments, a line of scripture seems to describe your situation with unsettling accuracy. This is not coincidence, it is communication. The Bible is not just information, it is interaction. When God responds, he frequently uses scripture to clarify, correct, or confirm what he is doing. You may notice the same themes repeating: trust, waiting, obedience, courage. God is not overwhelming you with new revelation. He is anchoring you in truth. This kind of response requires attentiveness. God does not always speak with volume. He speaks with consistency. When the same verse appears in your reading, you're listening, you're praying, it is often because God is emphasizing something essential. He is aligning your understanding with his will. If your prayer were ignored, scripture would feel distant or irrelevant. But when God is actively engaging, his word becomes personal. It doesn't just inform you, it addresses you. It brings clarity where confusion once ruled, and direction where uncertainty lingered. God never contradicts himself. When he answers through scripture, it is not to rush you, but to ground you. His word becomes the steady voice reminding you who he is, what he has promised, and why you can trust him, even when the outcome is still forming. Number 6. Your faith often feels tested during long seasons of waiting, more intensely than before. One of the most misunderstood signs that God has heard your prayer is resistance. Challenges increase, doubts surface, circumstances feel heavier rather than lighter. Many assume this means their prayer failed. Scripture suggests the opposite. When God begins to work, faith is often refined, not to break it, but to strengthen it. The Bible repeatedly shows that testing follows divine engagement. When prayers are heard, trust is developed, endurance is built, obedience is proven. Testing reveals what faith is rooted in. If it is dependent on outcomes, it collapses. If it is anchored in God's character, it grows. Resistance does not mean God has stepped away. It often means you are moving forward. This season can feel discouraging because it demands perseverance without immediate reward. Yet Scripture affirms that faith tested produces maturity. What feels like pressure is often preparation. God is shaping a faith that can withstand blessing without losing dependence on him. If God were absent, there would be no refinement, only indifference. But when he hears, he invests. He strengthens what you cannot yet see, ensuring that when the answer comes, your faith is deep enough to carry it. Number 7. You become less desperate and more trusting. One of the quietest yet strongest signs that God has heard your prayer is a shift in how tightly you are holding on. The need may still be there. The answer may still be delayed, but desperation no longer drives you, trust does. You find yourself praying with open hands instead of clenched fists, not because you've stopped wanting an answer, but because you've stopped fearing the weight. Control loosens. Anxiety loses its urgency. You begin to trust God's character more than your preferred outcome. This is not emotional resignation. It is spiritual maturity. The Bible shows that surrendered prayer is not weaker prayer. It is deeper prayer. When God hears, he teaches you to rest without disconnecting, to hope without striving, and to believe without demanding proof. You may notice that your prayers become simpler, more honest, less rehearsed. You are no longer trying to convince God only to align with Him. That shift is not self-produced. It is evidence that God has met you in the waiting. Trust grows where fear once dominated. Confidence replaces panic. You begin to believe that whatever the answer is, God will remain faithful. That belief does not come from circumstances improving. It comes from communion deepening. When desperation fades, it does not mean you care less. It means you trust more. And trust is one of the clearest signs that your prayer has reached God's heart. Conclusion: God hears every sincere prayer, not selectively, not conditionally, not only the eloquent ones or the perfectly timed ones. He hears the whispered prayers, the repeated prayers, the exhausted prayers, and even the ones that come with doubt still clinging to them. Silence is not absence. Delay is not denial. Redirection is not rejection. Scripture shows us a God who listens carefully, responds wisely, and works deeply, often in ways we do not immediately recognize. If you see these signs in your life, do not rush past them. They are evidence that God is closer than you think. He may not be changing the situation yet, but He is changing you, and that change is never wasted. Remain faithful in the waiting. Stay rooted in prayer, not because you are certain of the outcome, but because you are confident in the one who holds it. God is not ignoring you. He is working, and what He is preparing will be worth the trust He is asking from you now.